Welcome. I believe this is video 5 of our summer worship video series for the 10 Commandments, but we're actually to commandment number 6, which is thou shalt not commit adultery. Now, I do want to continue to encourage you. I hope you've been working on memorizing the 10 Commandments. But if you've done it, great. If you haven't quite got them all memorized, just want to encourage you. It's easy. There's only 10 of them. Actually, the last 2 are about the same, so it's only like memorizing 9 of them. But I do feel that if you have these 10 Commandments memorized, it will, just carrying these around is just very helpful for our life and for our faith. Again, I'm Pastor Eric Bostrom, and this is Pastor Bree Merkle, and we're pastors here at Mountain View Lutheran Church in Edgewood, Washington. So I think the way that we want to start this commandment, it's about adultery. And I think we mostly think of, adultery in the context of marriage, first of all. But what we've been doing throughout the series is also kind of taking it back to the historical and the biblical context of when the 10 Commandments were given. And that was at Mount Sinai right after Moses freed the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. And one of my curious questions is, when the Israelites were in slavery, was there any tradition or practice or institution of marriage? And if there was not, what did this commandment mean to them at Mount Sinai, that God is saying, you shall not commit adultery? Did that make them scratch their head? Did they think of a different kind of relationship? So anyway, that's just one of my questions that I have. The second thing is what Martin Luther brings up in his large catechism about this commandment, is he recognizes that in Jesus' day, Jewish culture was very unique in that it had a very, very high priority on marriage. In Jewish culture, they didn't want anyone to be single. They wanted everyone to be in the estate of marriage. That was really kind of essential, foundational for just Jewish culture. And this is why they would arrange marriages, because they didn't want, anyone, floating out there to be single. And so, in order to make that possible, they just would arrange everyone to be married. And so this commandment, you shall not commit adultery, really becomes essential in just kind of maintaining the fabric of that kind of culture
structure,
when it's so, essential for everyone to be married. Now, for today, we don't have that same kind of a Jewish culture, where it's, where we expect everyone to be married. Now we understand marriage is more of a choice. It's up to 2 people to get married to each other. And there's just so much, there's much a broad and expansive view of marriage in particular. So that's just kind of some historical background to kind of tee up. What are your insights on this?
I think the other helpful thing to remember about the context of marriage in Scripture is that it's often used as a metaphor to reflect our relationship with God as well. So there's kind of a double layer of meaning here. This commandment is about adultery with one's partner in marriage, but it's also looking back at reflecting on that relationship with God, which is meant to be steadfast and committed, and so in the scriptures, in the Hebrew scriptures especially, our relationship to God is frequently described as a marriage or a covenant, and so thinking about adultery as breaking of the covenant, we can see why that language is used in our relationship with God, and it's the prophets especially who speak to this. They're the ones who are calling out the people of Israel because we haven't maintained our fidelity to God, right? It's either for idol worship is one of the big things that the prophets speak to, or for not properly caring for God's people, particularly the orphan, the widow, and the stranger, right? And so those are the two things that most break our covenant with God, to are adulterous to our covenant with God in a sense. So there's kind of a second field in which this commandment plays out too, or we can think of this in terms of that covenant with God, covenant in marriage, also covenant with God.
That's helpful, because I think in terms of marriage, that's a much more formal kind of a covenant, but we are in all kinds of different relationships and partnerships throughout our life, whether it's at work, maybe it's at school, it's here at church, it's in our friendships, where we do kind of have this covenant that we've made with each other. And I find it helpful to understand this commandment, in a sense, protecting all of those covenant relationships that we make, the covenants of friendship, the covenants of, our work associates, the covenants, even the covenants that we make as citizens, in this country, when we're just walking on a trail and, just by fact that we're both, living in the same community or part of the same, that there is a covenant. Maybe it's an unspoken covenant, but there is a covenant, and we want to protect and not adulterate that. Yeah.
And that's where we can see how this can really be expanded beyond just a marriage partnership, but also beyond just the sense of physical adultery or sexual adultery, right? That there are other ways in which we can break relationships, and I think that's the ultimate concern behind this commandment, is the breaking of a relationship, and how likely that is to be possible or to happen in the case of adultery.
And we've been trying to tie all the commandments to, how does this make us more free?
Right.
And I think what God is trying to free us by, God knows that if we, when we honor our covenants with each other, that's how we experience the most freedom.
Right.
And if we're constantly living, with broken covenant after broken covenant, and, we're adulterating our covenants and our commitments to our neighbor and like that, well, we just live with a burden of unfreedom because of that.
Yeah. Well, and that's where a marriage is a good example. If adultery were to happen, the effect of that, right? The ripple effect beyond just the couple themselves, but their children, their extended family, their church community, the divisions, the fractures that happen as a result of that are just really deeply painful. And so that's where the heart of this covenant is to remind us of that how hard it is to heal and mend some of those fractures. And even how that can get carried forward into future relationships too, that, then that breaking, it's not only limited to the past then, but it can have a way of following us to, continuing to affect our relationships going forward. And so just the immense impact of when trust is broken and vulnerability is broken in a sense.
Yeah. I do think we do need to kind of address the sexuality of this, and I think Jesus is the one that kind of points us to kind of the sexual covenants, or maybe even just the sexual boundaries that that are healthy for us to live within, because in the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, Jesus addresses this commandment, you shall not commit adultery, but Jesus broadens it by saying, but even if you have lust in your heart, if you look at another woman and you have lust in your heart, which is a very private, internal kind of a thing, you have broken this commandment in a sense. And so there, I think we do need to also recognize that sexuality, as human beings, sexuality is a big part of being a human, and that comes with, physiology, but that also comes with, just the hormones and the thoughts and the temptations and all that stuff. And so I think this commandment is also calling us to kind of a discipline of what are healthy sexual boundaries. That's a part of the covenant that we make too. In a marriage covenant, that is where we enter into that realm. But outside, in other covenant relationships, there is a sexual boundary, and it's helpful not only that we maintain a physical boundary on all that, but Jesus is even inviting us to consider, what are those thought boundaries? What are those more kind of internal boundaries that we should have a measure of discipline in trying to maintain some of those boundaries? Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. The other helpful thing I think Jesus does in regards to the commandment on adultery is at one point he is, and this is in John's Gospel, a woman who has committed adultery is brought forward to him, and the people are kind of lifting her up and saying, well, according to the law, we should stone her, which, it's also, if you look back, there's not really clear, explicit examples that actually happened in Jewish culture. So there's some debate about whether that really would have been the punishment for adultery. But Jesus' reply then is, the one without sin can be the first to cast the stone. And so there's this grace too, that while we acknowledge the need for healthy sexual boundaries and the need for trust and respect in all of our relationships, that there's an acknowledgement that we're human too, and that we all sin, and that we have to have grace with one another, especially in the midst of holding the reality that we all sin and fall short of the glory of God. And so that's really important to say today too, as we're talking about a topic that's, can have deep impact on people's lives, that we acknowledge God's graces in the midst of all of our brokenness, whatever type of brokenness that is.
Yeah. And with all the commandments, I think we want to have a sense of how would this be spoken in the positive way?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, we learn the commandment, we hear the commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. But the positive way that we would put that is, how shall we, promote and build up and empower and encourage the covenants, that we make with each other. And if, we want to support, spouses that are married, we want to speak and act in ways that it helps them to have a stronger covenant, or we want to encourage friendships, we want to encourage the people that we work with, build all of those things up in a positive way.
So what would a healthy covenant with one another look like in a workplace? Well, perhaps it's when you have conflict with someone, you go and approach them first, rather than, bringing in the third party as the person to share your frustrations with, right? So how do we honor relationships and covenants with one another?
Yeah. And so then it just kind of gets down to the best practices of how we are in a relationship with each other. Yeah. That's kind of the opposite of adultery. Adulterating relationships is kind of generally everything that kind of tears down relationship. But this commandment in the positive really wants to do all those things that are positive and healthy and build up trust in our relationships, such as being more direct, listening well, listening with grace, speaking with honesty and courage, hanging in there with each other.
Offering confession and forgiveness to one another. Yeah. I would say adulterating a relationship is anything that, fails to recognize there is a covenant, right? And a covenant that we've agreed to honor in a way. So when we fail to honor a covenant, then that's a fracture. Yeah.
Well, I think I like this commandment a little bit more now after having talked through it.
A little bit. Yeah. It's a hard one.
Yeah.
I think this is one I struggled with too. How do we talk about this in positive ways? So, well, we appreciate you continuing to tune in for this summer video series, and we especially encourage, if you have reflections as you're listening to these videos, if you want to engage us in some conversation around us, to give either one of us a call or send us an email.
Yeah, we want to talk to you. If you're watching these videos, we want to talk about it.
Yeah, we want to hear what you're thinking about and what's sparking insight for you as we go along. So share your reflections with us. Give the video a like on social media, and tune in for the next commandment, which is on "You shall not steal."
See you next time.